Okay, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read The Life of the Mind, Hannah Arendt's last unfinished book. We're actually going to read only book one of that book on thinking, book two on willing. Where we're going to is fascinating and important, but quite philosophical. And at least our current plan is to leave that, and then book three on judging. She never wrote. We may have a final session where we talk about that. We're nearing the end. We have two more sessions on this book after today, and one of the things that we should start doing as we near the end is trying to understand the scope of the book and how it's working. And so maybe a little bit of backtracking is in order to start here. If we recall, the overarching question that Arendt is asking is about how thinking does not answer the need for truth, but the quest for meaning. And it's this quest for meaning as opposed to the quest for truth that really is the driving question of the whole book, let alone the section on thinking. And we need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to think? And how is thinking connected to the quest for meaning? In part two, Arendt specifically asks, sort of after the way and the place of thinking, how we think about thinking. And she says, in very schematic form, thinking needs speech. You can't think outside of speech. You can't think outside of some grammar, right? You can't just think without words in some way in which you think in. We think in words. That's a really profound insight. But she says thinking cannot be grasped in speech. The meaning that thinking seeks, in the sense that thinking is a quest for meaning, not a search for truth, is beyond words. And she cites Heidegger there, who has this idea that thinking is like a flash, or maybe happens in silence. And she says there's no metaphor for thinking, even though thinking itself takes place in metaphors that elevate us out of the everyday into the ineffable. There's no metaphor for thinking. What is the metaphor for thinking? And that's because the quest for meaning, which thinking is, has no result. And then she says at the end of that section, section 2, well, maybe there is a metaphor for thinking, or one that's close to it, and that is life, or being alive. Without the breath of life, the human body is a corpse. Without thinking, the human mind is dead. And this is really, about as close as we can get. To be alive is to think. Aristotle says the activity of thinking is life in Book Lambda of the Metaphysics. But even that metaphor, she says, is conceptually empty. It doesn't tell us anything about what thinking is. And so in the end, we can't really know what thinking is. And she says we need to move to another question, and that is not what thinking is, but what makes us think. And this brings us to part 3 of the first book of this book on thinking. And she says, well, what makes us think? And last week, Samantha led you through the first 2 chapters of this section. Very briefly, the Greek pre-philosophical idea is that we need poets and philosophers, spectators, another word for them, to perfect and correct the world of appearance. What poets do is they tell a story, and what philosophers do is tell us what is. And in so doing, they think. They give meaning to what is. They seek to immortalize, to make what is beautiful and true and coherent and ordered in a way that makes what is worthy of being loved and thus lasting. And these poets believe in an undying, an immortal world, but not yet an eternal world. They believe in an admiring and harmonious order. Plato, too, in the next chapter on the Answer of Plato, begins in wonder. To immortalize, to behold and admire in wonder is to offer a glimpse of harmony and of order and truth. But the wonder of Plato gives way, she says, to the nausea of Sartre. Whereas Plato and philosophers like him saw the world as essentially wonderful, admiring, worthy, and thus ordered. When you think of Kant, and Kant talks to you about the moral law, he says, when we see people act morally, when we see people act in ways that just shock us in their moral content, we get down on one knee. We bow to them, and we are in awe of them. And the moral law becomes visible to us through their actions, and we submit ourselves autonomously to the moral law. That's what it means to be to set oneself under the law, to give oneself the law. I must act such that the maximum of my action accords with universal law. I do it because I'm in awe of this thing that I've seen. But when the rationality of the world, the religiosity of the world, the sacrality of the world, the beauty of the world, the harmony of the world, when that falls apart, when we no longer believe that the world makes sense, when tradition disappears as a binding force on us, when religion disappears, when even reason becomes something that is divided and diffuse instead of singular, the order disappears, and instead of an awe before the world, we have Sartre's nausea. That brings us to the two chapters that we read for today. One is called The Roman Answer to the question of what makes us think, and one is called The Answer of Socrates to the question of what makes us think. Briefly, because I don't think it's the key chapter here, the Roman answer is simply fear. If you've read Hobbes, I've been teaching Hobbes or with a friend this week. Hobbes, the world is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. We are afraid. And everything that in Hobbes and all modern political philosophy emerges out of this central insight that we are afraid and we need to somehow escape the state of nature. For the Romans, we are afraid and we need to escape the world of fear. And the answer of Roman and largely Stoic philosophy in Arendt's reading is that we turn inward. We seek to philosophize in the sense of simply preserving our sovereign independent self against the world, so that we emerge as a sheer consciousness, she says, a new entity, completely independent and sovereign. Philosopher in the Roman sense seeks a refuge from reality in the certainty, the self-certainty, the sovereignty of the self, which is cut off from the world but at least can't be touched. And thus, for the Romans, the beginning of philosophy is the fear and thus the annihilation of reality. There's an interesting digression at the end of this section where she talks about Solon, the first great Greek lawgiver, who wanders across the whole Mediterranean, seeking wisdom and seeking new ways to give the law to a people before he comes back to Athens and gives the law, the Solonic Code, the first great Solonic Code. And while he's traveling, he comes across King Croesus. It's a famous story. And Crisis, what we all know that what Crisis asks, or most of us do, which is he asks who is the happiest, and he expects Solon to fawningly say, "Of course you are, King Croesus." But instead, Solon says, "No man is happy, and no man can consider happy until he is dead." But Arendt is actually interested more in what happens before that, which is that Croesus addresses Solon and says to him, um, "You are visiting and wandering around the world. What have you learned in your philosophizing?" Right? And Arendt says this is the first use of the word philosophy that we have. And so she says, what is philosophy? Well, as Croesus used it and as Solon offers it, it's a doctrine. The doctrine is you can't be considered happy until you die. And she says this is unsocratic. And this is a sort of, let's call it a tense transition into the next chapter, which is, I think, in many ways, the next two chapters on Socrates, this one and then the next one on the 2 and 1, could be considered the key chapters of this whole section on thinking, this whole first book of the life of the mind. And we're going to spend a lot of time on them. First, this one this week, and then the next one next week. What makes us think for Socrates? Well, if we have one answer, it's one word: love. Love is what makes us think. He says, philosophers and thinkers think out of a need. What is the need of thinking? Well, I'm going to choose a model, she says, an example. And this is a very Arendtian move. If thinking is something like being alive, if thinking is something that appears and yet can't appear, if something is invisible and we don't have a metaphor, how do we know what it is? Well, we have to pick a model. And in a very non-random choice, she picks Socrates as an ideal type of thinking. Why? Well, because in the end, Socrates is going to embody what she wants him to embody. It's a very, this is not a random choice. So there are 11 steps, I think, 11 points she now brings out about Socrates as the model of thinking and what makes us think. The first is that thinking is aporetic. It's an argument that leads nowhere. Socrates is well known for asking people questions and at the end saying, we've learned that we learn nothing. That's his great takeaway. Second, thinking is non-conceptual. Even though Socrates talks about things like justice and houses, he's actually not trying to give you definitions of these. In fact, his whole point is that he comes to the conclusion that there are no definitions of these things. Third, talking and thinking about justice and piety can make us more just and more pious. This is a point Arendt returns to in a really fascinating essay she writes that was just published in Thinking Without a Banister by Jerome Cohn. I wrote a piece on it, which was published on Medium on the Arendt Center website about 6 months ago. But in some way, Arendt embraces the Socratic idea that even though we don't know what justice is, and even though we don't know what piety is, thinking and talking and thinking about justice and piety can actually make us more just and more pious. Why that is, we should talk a little bit more in Q&A afterwards, but in its essence, it's that in thinking about justice and piety, we supply ourselves with models, with images, with exemplars, and we are inspired by them. Examples are the go-kart of moral judgment, Kant says. Here I think that's the foundation for her claim that talking and thinking about justice and piety can make us more pious and just. The fourth point that she makes is that there are three different metaphors that Socrates describes himself with. The first is a gadfly. As a gadfly, the thinker arouses others to thinking. He stings them, he buzzes around them, and he makes them think and examine themselves. He bothers them until they realize they don't know what they're talking about. The second is the midwife. And Socrates says he's a midwife because he delivers people to their thoughts. He purges them of their opinions, their doxa, their false thoughts. He shows them their doxa is wrong, or as he puts it, is a wind egg, not a real baby. And thus, as a sterile person, the doctor, Socrates, the midwife, he simply shows you that your thoughts are wrong, and thus delivers you to thinking, which is being perplexed. The third is the electric ray, who stings you and freezes you, paralyzes you, and makes you stop and think. And even though you're frozen, that stopping and thinking, she says, is the highest feeling of being alive. So those are the three metaphors that he describes himself as. Fifth point is that Socrates is not a philosopher. He teaches us nothing. He's also not a sophist. He doesn't claim to make men wise. In fact, he claims the opposite. He claims to unteach you. The sixth point is, what is thinking good for? Or the question is, what is thinking good for, or why think? Arendt says that thinking is like an invisible wind or a storm of thought. And what it does, if you stand in the storm, in the windstorm, and don't seek refuge in concepts or in ideologies, what thinking does is it destroys all creeds. It's the most dangerous thing because it destroys all things that stand in its way, all ideas that want to hold on and say we are true. Which is why Arendt can say here, and again in her famous essay on thinking and moral considerations, that there are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. What she means by that is that thinking is destructive. It destroys all certainties, all creeds. That's number 7. Thinking can lead to cynicism and nihilism. Thus, the danger of thinking is not that it destroys things per se. It's that if you take its destructive capacity as the essence of thinking, as nihilists do, you make the nihilist conclusion that there is no truth. That thinking shows us that there is no justice, there is nothing good, and therefore everything is permitted, is the nihilist mantra. And that's the danger of thinking. The 8th point is that although nihilism is the danger of thinking, nihilism is not inherent in thinking. Namely, a thinker doesn't have to give in to nihilism. You can stand in the storm of thought and not think that nothing matters and that there are no highest thoughts and that everything is permitted. You can question all creeds and yet still know the importance of believing in something. The 9th point is that the greater danger than thinking, which would be nihilism, is non-thinking. And the danger of non-thinking is that if you don't think, you're caught up in ideologies and rules, and you believe in rules, and you believe in following rules and following customs and following orders. And there's nothing easier, she says, than taking rule-bound, orderly men and women and changing the rules that they follow. And she says you can do that as easy as we change the silverware at a dinner table. And that's what she thinks happened in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. You had rule-bound, very conformist populations, and you had a dictator demagogue come in who simply gave them new rules to follow, and they followed them because they follow rules. They didn't think. The 10th point is that to think and to be fully alive are the same, which was the same way she ended the last section. And then the 11th point is that the quest for meaning requires thinking, which requires love. What do we love? Love is a need, and what we need and what we love is meaning. So the true thinkers are those who love meaning and know they don't have it, and turn to thinking as a way of seeking meaning.